Rebecca Grayson was the kind of woman who didn't back down. Analytical, sharp, and fiercely independent, she had spent her life methodically dismantling every obstacle in her way. Her latest battle wasn't in the boardrooms where she worked as a financial analyst, but on the land she called home. The house, a restored piece of her family's legacy, sat on a sprawling plot of land at the edge of a suburban development. Surrounded by manicured lawns and uniform cookie-cutter homes, Rebecca's property was an outlier. At its center stood a massive oak tree, over 150 years old, its sprawling branches casting a protective shadow over her home. This tree wasn't just a landmark, it was a symbol. Her great-grandfather had planted it when he first settled on the land, and it had stood through generations of storms, wars, and progress, as unyielding as her family's legacy. For Rebecca, it was more than just wood and leaves. It was a testament to resilience and rootedness in an ever-changing world. Rebecca's relationship with the Homeowners Association, HOA, in her neighborhood had always been tense. The HOA's rules, which dictated the color of fences, the types of plants allowed in gardens, and even the height of mailboxes, were little more than annoyances to Rebecca. She had never joined their meetings, nor had she paid much attention to their notices, confident that her property originally outside their jurisdiction was exempt from their nitpicky regulations. However, that hadn't stopped the HOA's president, Luke Decker, from trying to assert control. Decker, a polished man with a permanent smirk and a penchant for using rules as weapons, had made it his mission to bring Rebecca into compliance with the HOA's standards. Over the past year, she had ignored countless letters threatening fines for her unkempt yard and the unsafe condition of her tree. The pressure escalated at the last HOA meeting. Rebecca attended a rare occasion when she decided to confront the increasingly aggressive letters head-on. Decker stood at the front of the room in his neatly pressed suit, commanding the crowd like a politician. As many of you know, there's a certain property in this neighborhood that remains out of alignment with our community's values, he began, his voice dripping with faux diplomacy. Everyone in the room knew he was talking about Rebecca's house. Decker continued, "The oak tree on that property is a danger not just to the homeowner, but to all of us. Imagine if it fell during a storm. It could destroy homes, injure people, or worse. For the safety of our community, we must insist it be removed." Rebecca stood abruptly, her voice slicing through the murmurs of agreement. "That tree is on my property. It's healthy, it's stable, and it's none of your business." The room fell silent, but Decker didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled that infuriatingly smug smile and said, "Ms. Grayson, the HOA has a duty to ensure the safety of all residents. If you won't act, we may be forced to take measures to protect the community." His tone was calm, almost condescending, but his words were a clear threat. Rebecca left the meeting seething. Over the next few weeks, she received multiple follow-up letters, each one more aggressive than the last. One letter claimed the tree violated updated aesthetic guidelines. Another insisted it was an imminent hazard. And a final notice threatened a $15,000 fine if she didn't remove it within 30 days. She ignored them all, confident in her legal standing. To be sure, she hired an independent arborist, who confirmed what she already knew. The tree was perfectly healthy and posed no danger. She sent the report to the HOA, attaching a firm letter of her own that stated, in no uncertain terms, that any further attempts to interfere with her property would be met with legal action. But the HOA didn't stop. One morning, Rebecca found a large branch from her tree lying across her driveway. It wasn't storm season, and the cut at the base of the branch was suspiciously clean, as though someone had used a saw. Next to the branch was a note, handwritten on plain paper. "The tree is a hazard. You've been warned." Furious, Rebecca installed a security camera near the tree and contacted the local police. However, without evidence of who was responsible, the officer who responded could only shrug and tell her to keep an eye out. The situation came to a head one Friday evening when Rebecca returned home to find a formal notice pinned to her door. It wasn't just another letter. This one was stamped with the words "Final Warning" in bold red ink. The letter demanded immediate compliance with the HOA's directive to remove the tree, claiming that failure to do so would result in necessary action taken on behalf of the community. Rebecca crumpled the letter in her fist, her anger reaching a boiling point. She stormed into her house, determined to fight back harder than ever. That weekend, Rebecca packed a bag and left town to attend a conference for work, hoping a few days away would clear her mind. When she returned late Sunday evening, the sight that greeted her as she turned into her driveway made her heart drop. The massive oak tree was gone, but it hadn't been removed, it had been felled. Worse, the trunk had been deliberately angled to crash into her home, splitting her roof in two and crushing half of her house under its enormous weight. Shattered glass, broken beams, and debris littered her yard, while the smell of fresh sawdust hung heavy in the air. As Rebecca stepped out of her car, she noticed men in orange vests milling around the site. One of them carried a chainsaw, while another loaded chunks of the tree into the back of a pickup truck. At the center of the chaos stood Luke Decker, his hands clasped behind his back, a smug expression plastered across his face. "Good evening, Ms. Grayson," he said, his voice infuriatingly casual. "I see you've returned. As you can see, we've resolved the safety issue for you. You're welcome." Rebecca's hands balled into fists. "You've destroyed my house," she yelled, her voice echoing across the yard. Decker didn't flinch. "The tree was a danger," he replied smoothly. "The community comes first. If you'd complied earlier, none of this would have happened." Rebecca stared at him, her anger turning into cold, calculated resolve. She wasn't just going to fight back, she was going to destroy him. Rebecca Grayson stood frozen in the middle of the chaos, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what had happened. Her once pristine home was now a disaster zone. The oak tree, which had stood tall and unwavering for over a century, now lay sprawled across her property like a giant fallen warrior. Splintered wood, shards of glass, and mangled furniture were scattered everywhere. The front half of her house was completely destroyed, the roof caved in under the tree's massive weight. The sight of it all was so overwhelming that, for a moment, she couldn't breathe. She clenched her fists tightly, forcing herself to focus, as Luke Decker approached her with that infuriating smirk still plastered on his face. "Ms. Grayson," Decker began, his tone dripping with condescension, "I understand this may be upsetting for you, but I assure you, this action was necessary for the safety of the community." He gestured toward the fallen tree as though it were a trophy. The association couldn't wait any longer. The tree was a hazard, and it had to be removed. "I trust you'll understand." Rebecca's jaw tightened, her anger boiling beneath the surface. "You've destroyed my house," she said, her voice low and trembling with fury. "You had no right to touch that tree, let alone cut it down. And don't you dare try to justify this as a safety issue. That tree was healthy. I have the reports to prove it." Decker tilted his head, feigning concern. "Healthy or not, Ms. Grayson, the risk was too great. The HOA board made a unanimous decision to act before it was too late. You've ignored our requests for months, so we had no choice but to intervene." Rebecca stared at him in disbelief. "No choice?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You think this gives you the right to destroy private property? To ruin my home? You've crossed a line, Decker, and I'm going to make sure you pay for it." Decker's smirk faded slightly, but only for a moment. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "You're welcome to try, Ms. Grayson, but I'd suggest you think carefully before you make any rash decisions. This is a losing battle for you. The HOA has the authority to enforce community standards, and your refusal to cooperate has left us no alternative. Frankly, you should be grateful we acted before someone got hurt." Rebecca felt her hands tremble with rage, but she refused to let him see it. Instead, she took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing. "This isn't over," she said coldly. "Not by a long shot." Decker straightened, his smug expression returning. "Well, I'll leave you to assess the damage," he said, turning to walk away. Over his shoulder, he added, "Oh, and I trust you'll handle the cleanup quickly. The HOA has strict rules about debris on properties." Rebecca watched as he strode back toward his car, where several other members of the HOA board were waiting. She could see them talking and laughing among themselves, as though they had just won some petty power game. The sight of it made her stomach turn. She turned back to the scene in front of her, the reality of the situation sinking in. Her home was uninhabitable, her possessions were destroyed, and the tree, her family's symbol of resilience, was gone. She had to act, and fast. She pulled out her phone and began taking pictures of everything: the tree, the damage to her house, the debris strewn across her yard. She zoomed in on the trampled grass around the stump, where she noticed deep grooves in the dirt that looked like they had been made by heavy equipment. Someone had used machinery to pull the tree down, deliberately angling it to fall on her house. It wasn't an accident. This was sabotage. As she moved around the yard documenting the scene, one of the workers approached her hesitantly. He was a younger man, probably in his 20s, and he looked nervous. "Mom," he said, glancing over his shoulder as though worried someone might overhear, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry about your house. This wasn't supposed to happen like this." Rebecca narrowed her eyes at him. "What do you mean?" she asked sharply. "What wasn't supposed to happen?" The man shifted uncomfortably, lowering his voice. "I wasn't part of the crew that cut the tree down. I just came to help with cleanup. But I heard the guys talking earlier. They said Decker told them to make sure the tree fell on the house. Said it would solve the problem once and for all." Rebecca's heart raced as she processed his words. "Did you hear this directly?" she asked, her voice urgent. "Would you be willing to testify to that?" The man hesitated, glancing over his shoulder again. I don't know. I can't afford to lose this job. Decker's got connections, and I can't risk him blacklisting me." Rebecca felt a surge of frustration but managed to keep her tone calm. "Listen," she said, stepping closer. "What they did was illegal. They destroyed my property and endangered my life. If you're willing to help me prove it, I'll make sure you're protected. I can get you legal counsel. You won't have to face this alone." The man looked torn, his eyes darting between Rebecca and the crew loading the tree debris into their truck. Finally, he shook his head. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "I can't." He turned and walked away quickly, leaving Rebecca standing there, her fists clenched in anger. She spent the next few hours documenting everything she could. She took photos of the tree stump, where fresh sawdust and cut marks were clearly visible. She noted the positions of the fallen branches and the direction in which the trunk had fallen, further confirming her suspicion that it had been deliberately angled toward her house. She even recorded a video of the workers loading pieces of the tree into their truck, capturing their license plate numbers for evidence. Once she had gathered as much documentation as possible, she called her attorney, James Reeves. James was sharp, relentless, and exactly the kind of person she needed on her side. When she explained what had happened, he didn't waste any time. "This is a clear case of property damage and illegal trespass," he said firmly. "We're going to hit them with everything we've got, but first I need you to secure any evidence you can before they try to cover their tracks. Send me the photos and videos you've taken, and I'll start drafting a formal complaint." Rebecca spent the rest of the night reviewing her homeowner's insurance policy and making a list of everything that had been destroyed. The more she thought about what had happened, the angrier she became. This wasn't just an attack on her property, it was an attack on her autonomy, her right to live on her land without interference. The HOA had overstepped their bounds, and she was determined to make them pay. The next morning, she woke to the sound of voices outside her window. She looked out to see a group of HOA board members standing in her yard, pointing and gesturing at the damage. Among them was Decker, his smug expression as infuriating as ever. Rebecca grabbed her phone and stormed outside, ready for a confrontation. "Can I help you?" she demanded, her voice cutting through their conversation. The group turned to face her, and Decker stepped forward, that same condescending tone in his voice. "Miss Grayson, we were just discussing the unfortunate situation here. The HOA is willing to offer assistance in cleaning up the debris, provided, of course, that you agree to our terms moving forward." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "Your terms?" she repeated, her voice icy. "You mean the terms where I let you dictate what I can and can't do on my own property? Not a chance." Decker's smile faltered, but only for a moment. "I'm afraid you don't have much of a choice," he said smoothly. "The HOA has the authority to enforce community standards, and you've made it clear that you're unwilling to cooperate. If you continue to resist, things will only get more difficult for you." Rebecca took a step closer, her voice low and steady. "You've already made things difficult, Decker. But you've also made a mistake. You think you can bully me into submission, but you're wrong. I'm not backing down, and I'm not going anywhere. So enjoy your little power trip while it lasts, because it's about to end." As she turned and walked back toward her ruined house, Rebecca felt a surge of determination. Decker had declared war, but he didn't realize who he was up against. She wasn't just going to fight back, she was going to make sure he and his entire operation crumbled under the weight of their own corruption. This was only the beginning. Rebecca knew she couldn't afford to waste any time. With her home in ruins and the HOA growing bolder by the day, she had to act quickly to build her case and take back control of her life. She spent the next morning on the phone with her attorney, James Reeves, recounting every detail of the situation and sending him the photos and videos she had taken. James was furious on her behalf. "They've not only committed property damage, but it's also clear they trespassed and endangered you in the process," he said. "We'll be filing for damages and an injunction against further interference immediately. But you need to be careful, Rebecca. These people are playing dirty, and they won't stop until they get what they want." Rebecca appreciated James's candor, but she was already aware of what she was up against. The HOA's actions weren't just reckless, they were calculated. They wanted her gone, and they were willing to do whatever it took to achieve that. Still, she wasn't about to let them intimidate her into submission. If they thought she was an easy target, they were about to learn otherwise. That same day, Rebecca hired a structural engineer to assess the damage to her house. The engineer, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia, spent hours examining the wreckage, taking measurements and photos, and scribbling notes in a battered notebook. When she finally finished, she approached Rebecca with a grim expression. "The way this tree fell wasn't natural," Patricia said. "It's clear someone used machinery to pull it down, and they deliberately angled it toward the house. This wasn't an accident, it was sabotage." Rebecca felt a surge of vindication, though it was tempered by anger. "Can you put that in writing?" she asked. Patricia nodded. "Absolutely. I'll include it in my report. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry this happened to you. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Armed with Patricia's report and James's legal expertise, Rebecca felt a renewed sense of purpose. But as she began to gather more evidence, she realized just how deep the HOA's corruption ran. Through a combination of public records, requests, and discreet inquiries, James uncovered a troubling pattern. The HOA had a history of targeting homeowners who resisted their authority. Over the past few years, several residents had been forced to sell their homes after sudden rule changes or aggressive fines made it impossible for them to stay. In nearly every case, the properties were quickly purchased by a single real estate developer, Terranova Development. The name sent a chill down Rebecca's spine. Terranova was a well-known developer with a reputation for ruthlessly acquiring land and turning it into high-end subdivisions. If they were behind the HOA's actions, it meant this was bigger than just her tree. It was part of a coordinated effort to drive her out and take her land. As Rebecca dug deeper, she began to notice strange activity around her property. Trucks would park nearby late at night, their headlights off, and then disappear before she could get a good look at them. One evening, she found fresh tire tracks near the stump of her tree, along with small holes in the ground that looked like someone had been digging. Whatever they were searching for, they clearly thought it was worth risking exposure. Rebecca decided to take matters into her own hands. She installed additional security cameras around her property, focusing on the areas where she had seen the most activity. She also purchased motion-activated floodlights and a high-decibel alarm system determined to catch anyone who tried to trespass again. Her preparations paid off sooner than she expected. Just a few nights later, the alarm blared, jolting Rebecca awake. She grabbed a flashlight and her phone, rushing outside to see what had triggered the system. As she approached the area near the tree stump, she saw two figures dressed in dark clothing, crouching in the dirt with shovels. They froze when the floodlights activated, their faces obscured by masks. One of them cursed under his breath, and they bolted toward a waiting truck parked at the edge of her property. Rebecca snapped as many photos as she could, capturing the truck's license plate before it sped away. The next morning, she reviewed the footage from her security cameras and sent everything to James. "This is exactly what we needed," he said when she called to follow up. "Not only does this prove trespassing, but it also shows they're actively targeting your property for some reason. We're going to subpoena the HOA's records to find out what they're after." But Rebecca's fight was far from over. The HOA began escalating their efforts to pressure her into leaving. Within days of the trespassing incident, she received a new notice from the HOA, claiming that her property was in violation of multiple community standards. The letter listed absurd infractions. Her mailbox was not compliant with the neighborhood aesthetic, her damaged roof was an eyesore, and her security system was a disturbance to the community. Each violation carried a hefty fine, totaling over $20,000. Rebecca was livid. The fines were clearly retaliatory, a blatant attempt to intimidate her. She forwarded the letter to James, who assured her that the fines were unenforceable. "They're grasping at straws," he said. "They know they're in trouble, and they're trying to make you crack. Don't let them." Despite James's reassurances, the pressure was relentless. Neighbors who had once been friendly began to avoid Rebecca, refusing to meet her eyes or return her greetings. It was clear the HOA was spreading rumors about her, painting her as a troublemaker who was dragging down property values. One afternoon, as Rebecca was unloading groceries from her car, she overheard two women whispering nearby. "She's the one causing all the problems," one of them said. "If she'd just follow the rules, none of this would have happened." Rebecca clenched her teeth and forced herself to ignore them. She knew better than to waste energy on gossip. Her focus had to remain on the bigger picture, exposing the HOA's corruption and holding them accountable. The turning point came when James uncovered a critical piece of evidence. Through a combination of court filings and whistleblower testimony, he obtained internal emails from the HOA board. The emails revealed a coordinated effort to target Rebecca's property, with Decker leading the charge. In one email, Decker explicitly instructed the board to eliminate the problem by any means necessary. Another email outlined a deal with Terra Nova Development, promising the company first rights to purchase Rebecca's land once she was forced out. The messages were damning, laying bare the extent of the HOA's scheme. Rebecca felt a mix of rage and satisfaction as she read through the emails. "This is it," she told James. "This is the proof we need to take them down." James agreed, but he cautioned her to stay vigilant. "Decker's going to fight this tooth and nail," he said. "He's not the type to go down quietly. Be prepared for him to push back hard." Rebecca took his warning to heart. She doubled down on her security measures, making sure every inch of her property was monitored. She also began reaching out to her neighbors, sharing what she had learned about the HOA's corruption. At first, most of them were hesitant to get involved, fearing retaliation. But as Rebecca showed them the evidence, a few began to speak out, admitting that they too had been pressured by the HOA in the past. The momentum was building, but Rebecca knew the fight was far from over. Decker and his allies weren't just going to give up. They had too much to lose. But Rebecca wasn't backing down either. This wasn't just about her home anymore, it was about standing up to a system that thrived on intimidation and greed. She had already lost her house and her family's tree, but she refused to lose her dignity. This battle was personal, and Rebecca intended to win. Rebecca Grayson had been fighting battles all her life, but nothing could have prepared her for the level of underhanded schemes and relentless harassment she now faced from the HOA. Despite her best efforts to maintain control, she was beginning to feel the weight of their relentless pressure. The emails James had uncovered confirmed her worst fears. This wasn't just about a tree or community rules. This was a calculated land grab, and she was the one obstacle standing in their way. It wasn't just her house or her land anymore, it was the principle. The emails showed that the HOA had actively worked with Terra Nova Development to force out difficult homeowners like her, all to pave the way for a massive luxury development project. But Rebecca wasn't just going to fight for her home, she was going to expose the entire operation. The first step was to figure out exactly what they were after. The mysterious digging around the tree stump, the frequent trespassing, and the emails referencing critical infrastructure suggested there was something more to her land than she'd realized. Rebecca went back to the documents her great-grandfather had left behind when he first purchased the property. Amid the yellowed papers and faded deeds, she found a map. It was hand-drawn and marked with what appeared to be old mining routes. Her property, it turned out, sat atop one of the main access points to an abandoned network of tunnels that stretched for miles beneath the neighborhood. Rebecca had heard stories about the tunnels as a child, how they were part of a failed mining operation in the early 1900s and had been sealed off after multiple cave-ins. She'd always thought they were just local legends, but now it seemed the stories were true. The tunnels were marked with symbols that Rebecca didn't recognize, so she took the map to an archivist at the local historical society. The archivist, an older man with a keen eye for detail, examined the map closely and confirmed what she suspected. These tunnels were part of a large-scale mining operation that was abandoned in the 1920s, he explained. But here's the interesting part: they were later repurposed during World War II for storage. I bet the symbols you're seeing are related to that. Storage for what? Rebecca asked, her curiosity piqued. The archivist shrugged. Could be anything: military equipment, valuable resources, even records. The government used to hide all sorts of things in places like this. If your land has access to those tunnels, it might explain why someone wants it so badly. Rebecca's mind raced as she considered the implications. If the tunnels contained something valuable, it would explain why the HOA and Terra Nova development were so determined to push her out. But it also meant her fight was far from over. When she returned home, she found yet another letter from the HOA waiting in her mailbox. This one was a formal notice informing her that the board had voted to declare her property a community hazard due to the damage caused by the fallen tree. They demanded immediate repairs and threatened legal action if she didn't comply within 14 days. It was a thinly veiled attempt to pressure her into abandoning the fight, but Rebecca wasn't backing down. She called James and explained what she'd learned about the tunnels. He was immediately intrigued. If there's any chance the tunnels are still accessible, we need to document it, he said. It could be the key to proving that this isn't just about HOA regulations, it's about something much bigger. Rebecca decided to explore the area around the tree stump more thoroughly. With James's advice in mind, she carefully examined the ground, looking for any signs of access points to the tunnels. She noticed that the soil near the stump was looser than the rest of her yard, as though someone had recently disturbed it. Using a small spade, she began to dig, uncovering fragments of old wood and rusted metal. Finally, she hit something solid, a flat, rectangular slab of concrete embedded in the ground. The slab was too heavy to lift on her own, so she called a contractor she trusted to help her. When they managed to pry it open, they discovered a narrow shaft leading down into darkness. The air that rose from the opening was damp and smelled faintly of earth and decay. Rebecca's heart raced as she realized she had found one of the tunnel entrances. She didn't descend immediately. Instead, she took photographs and documented the discovery, sending everything to James. He agreed that they needed to proceed cautiously. If this is what they've been after, it could be dangerous, he warned. We don't know what's down there or who might be watching. Rebecca's suspicions were confirmed later that night when her motion-activated cameras picked up activity near the tunnel entrance. A group of men in dark clothing was prowling around her yard, their movements purposeful and coordinated. One of them carried what looked like a crowbar, while another appeared to be holding a small device Rebecca couldn't identify. She activated the floodlights and blared the alarm, but instead of scattering like the trespassers she'd encountered before, these men seemed prepared. They moved quickly, retreating to a black SUV parked just outside her property line. As they drove off, Rebecca managed to capture their license plate on video. She sent the footage to James, who promised to have it traced. The next morning, Rebecca found a new threat waiting for her. A bright yellow sign had been staked into her yard, declaring the property condemned by order of the Homeowners Association. It was clearly a bluff. The HOA didn't have the authority to condemn property, but it was a bold move that signaled they were escalating their tactics. James filed an immediate injunction against the HOA, accusing them of harassment, trespassing, and unlawful interference with her property. The legal filing sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, and several of Rebecca's neighbors began to approach her privately, sharing their own stories of intimidation and abuse by the HOA. One neighbor, a middle-aged man named Greg, admitted that he had been forced to sell his home after the HOA fined him for unauthorized landscaping and threatened foreclosure. They targeted me because I wouldn't join their meetings, Greg explained. I tried to fight back, but they wore me down. I couldn't afford the legal fees, so I sold to Terranova just to get out. Another neighbor, a woman named Karen, revealed that she had been fined for painting her front door the wrong shade of blue. They don't care about the rules, Karen said bitterly. They just want to control everything. If you don't fall in line, they'll find a way to make your life miserable. Rebecca realized that she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for an entire community that had been silenced and exploited. The HOA's corruption ran deep, and it was time to bring it to light. James worked tirelessly to gather evidence, while Rebecca continued to document everything that happened on her property. She even hired a private investigator to dig into Terranova Development's dealings, hoping to uncover the connection between the tunnels and the HOA's actions. What the investigator found was even more damning than Rebecca had anticipated. Terranova had a long history of partnering with HOAs to force out homeowners, using tactics that ranged from legal loopholes to outright intimidation. In several cases, the company had been accused of falsifying property surveys and bribing local officials to rezone land. Rebecca knew she was on the verge of something big. The tunnels, the land grab, the HOA's aggressive tactics, it was all connected. But as she prepared to take her fight to the next level, she couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA wasn't done with her yet. Decker and his allies weren't just going to sit back and let her expose them. They had too much to lose, and Rebecca knew they were capable of anything. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Rebecca felt like she had the upper hand. She wasn't just defending her home anymore, she was uncovering a conspiracy that had been hidden for years. And she wasn't going to stop until everyone responsible was held accountable. Rebecca Grayson had uncovered enough to know she was no longer fighting a petty neighborhood dispute. The Homeowners Association's harassment wasn't just about control, it was part of a calculated scheme to take her land and silence her. But knowing the truth didn't make her battle any easier. If anything, it made the stakes higher and the attacks against her more personal. In the days following the discovery of the tunnel entrance on her property, Rebecca noticed a significant escalation in the HOA's tactics. It started with another wave of letters, each one more absurd than the last. She was fined $5,000 for failure to maintain community standards because of the wreckage caused by the fallen tree wreckage they had created. Another notice accused her of violating noise regulations after she installed motion-activated alarms. Each letter was designed to overwhelm her with bureaucracy and drain her resources. But it wasn't just letters. Late one night, Rebecca was jolted awake by the sound of shattering glass. She grabbed a flashlight and ran downstairs to find her kitchen window broken. Lying on the floor amidst the shards of glass was a brick with a note attached. The message was simple and chilling: leave before it's too late. Rebecca called the police, but when the officer arrived, he offered little help. No witnesses, no security footage, no way to prove who did it, he said with a shrug. Best advice? Maybe consider moving. Seems like someone really wants you out of here. That wasn't an option. Rebecca refused to be intimidated, but the incident left her shaken. She installed reinforced locks, boarded up the broken window, and added more cameras to her property. Still, the constant feeling of being watched weighed on her. Every time she stepped outside, she noticed cars slowing as they passed her house, their drivers staring a little too long. She began to suspect that some of her neighbors were complicit in the HOA's schemes, either out of fear or greed. Then came the workers. One afternoon, Rebecca returned from a meeting with her attorney to find a crew of men in hard hats standing on her lawn, operating heavy equipment. They had parked a large truck over the tunnel entrance and were unloading tools. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" Rebecca demanded, storming toward them. One of the workers, a burly man with a clipboard, looked up from his paperwork. "We're here on behalf of the HOA," he said matter-of-factly. "We've been authorized to assess the safety of this area. It's a routine inspection." "This is private property," Rebecca snapped. "You have no right to be here. Leave now, or I'll call the police." The man didn't flinch. "You're welcome to do that, Mom, but we've got the HOA's approval. If you'd like to take it up with them, feel free." Rebecca pulled out her phone and began recording. "You've got 10 seconds to get off my land, or you'll be dealing with my lawyer," she said, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. The workers exchanged nervous glances before reluctantly packing up their tools and leaving, but Rebecca knew they'd be back. The next morning, she found another letter from the HOA taped to her front door. This one accused her of obstructing a sanctioned safety inspection and warned her that further interference would result in legal consequences. The letter was signed, as always, by Luke Decker, whose arrogance seemed to know no bounds. Rebecca's attorney, James Reeves, was livid when she told him about the incident. "This isn't just harassment, it's illegal," he said. "We're filing for an emergency injunction to stop them from stepping foot on your property again. And I'm going to push for criminal charges for the brick incident while we're at it." But the HOA wasn't done escalating. A few days later, Rebecca woke up to find her yard vandalized. Someone had spray-painted threatening messages on her fence, including "Get out now and you don't belong here." Her mailbox had been smashed, and the tires on her car had been slashed. Rebecca was furious, but she was also scared. The attacks were becoming more aggressive, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were building towards something bigger. She called James and asked him to expedite the injunction, but even as she took steps to protect herself, she couldn't ignore the toll the harassment was taking. One evening, after yet another sleepless night, Rebecca sat on the edge of her bed, her head in her hands. She felt like she was fighting a war on all fronts with the HOA, with her neighbors, and with her own growing exhaustion. She thought about her great-grandfather, who had planted the oak tree as a promise to never give up on the land he loved. That promise had been passed down through generations, and Rebecca wasn't about to break it. But she also knew she couldn't do this alone. She began reaching out to other homeowners who had been targeted by the HOA. At first, most were hesitant to talk. They had seen what the HOA was capable of and didn't want to become the next target. But slowly, Rebecca began to build a coalition. One by one, her neighbors started sharing their stories of fines, intimidation, and forced sales. Some had been coerced into selling their homes for a fraction of their value, while others had been driven out by endless legal battles. One neighbor, Greg, revealed that the HOA had threatened to foreclose on his home over an unpaid fine for having the wrong type of grass in his yard. Another neighbor, Karen, said she was fined for having her recycling bins visible from the street, even though there was no rule against it. Their stories painted a picture of an organization that operated more like a mafia than a neighborhood association. Rebecca began documenting their testimonies, collecting every detail she could to build a case against the HOA. She shared her findings with James, who was increasingly optimistic about their chances in court. "We've got a strong case," he said. "If we can prove that the HOA is acting in bad faith and we can tie it back to Terra Nova Development, they're going to have a lot to answer for." But the HOA wasn't going down without a fight. Luke Decker called an emergency board meeting and invited the entire neighborhood to attend. The meeting was held in the community center, and when Rebecca arrived, she immediately felt the weight of hostility in the room. Decker stood at the front, flanked by other board members, and addressed the crowd with his usual air of smug authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we've all seen the disruption that one homeowner can cause when they refuse to follow the rules. Ms. Grayson's refusal to cooperate has not only endangered our community but has also cost us time and resources. This behavior cannot continue." Rebecca stood up, her voice cutting through the murmurs of agreement. "You're blaming me for your own corruption," she said. "But the truth is coming out, Decker. Everyone here is going to see what kind of operation you're running, and when they do, you'll be the one paying the price." Decker's smirk faltered for the first time. "Ms. Grayson," he said coolly, "your baseless accusations have no place here. If you have evidence, I suggest you take it to court. Until then, I'd advise you to tread carefully." Rebecca met his gaze, refusing to back down. "Don't worry," she said. "I will." As she left the meeting, Rebecca felt a surge of determination. Decker was right about one thing: this would end in court. But when it did, she was going to make sure the HOA's corruption was exposed for everyone to see. They had underestimated her from the beginning, and now they were going to pay the price. The courtroom was packed. Rebecca sat at the plaintiff's table, her back straight and her gaze fixed on the judge. This was the moment she had been working toward, the culmination of weeks of harassment, sabotage, and defiance. On the other side of the room sat Luke Decker, smug as ever, flanked by a team of attorneys hired by the HOA and directly Terra Nova Development. He looked calm, confident, as though the outcome of this trial was a foregone conclusion. But Rebecca wasn't here to lose. She had spent every waking moment preparing for this fight, gathering evidence, compiling testimonies, and ensuring no detail was overlooked. Her attorney, James Reeves, had been relentless in building their case, and today they would prove once and for all that the HOA had overstepped its bounds in a way that was not only unethical but illegal. The judge called the court to order, and the trial began. The HOA's lawyers led with the same tired argument they had been using from the start, that the oak tree was a safety hazard, that Rebecca's refusal to comply with their removal orders had put the neighborhood at risk, and that the damage to her property was an unfortunate but necessary consequence of ensuring community safety. Decker took the stand, delivering his rehearsed testimony with a measured tone. He painted himself as a responsible leader, someone who had acted only in the best interests of the neighborhood. The tree was unstable, he said, his voice dripping with feigned concern. We couldn't take the chance that it might fall and cause harm. Ms. Grayson left us no choice but to act decisively. Rebecca clenched her fists under the table, but she kept her face neutral. James had warned her to let him handle this. When it was time for cross-examination, he approached Decker with a calm intensity that immediately put the HOA president on edge. You've stated that the tree was unstable, James began. Can you provide the court with any arborist report or professional assessment that supports this claim? Decker hesitated, but only for a fraction of a second. The HOA conducted its own evaluation, he replied smoothly. We have experienced members who are capable of identifying such risks. James raised an eyebrow. So, no professional report? No certified arborist opinion? Decker's jaw tightened. No, but James didn't let him finish. And yet, Ms. Grayson provided a certified report from an independent arborist stating the tree was healthy and posed no danger. Isn't that correct? Decker shifted uncomfortably. That report was incomplete. James stepped closer, holding up a copy of the report. This is the full report, Mr. Decker. It explicitly states that the tree was in excellent condition. Did you or anyone on the HOA board read this before ordering its removal? Decker's silence spoke volumes. James pressed on. Let's move on to the damage caused by the tree. You've claimed this was an accident, but we have photographic evidence showing that heavy machinery was used to pull the tree down in a specific direction toward Ms. Grayson's house. Care to explain that? Decker's composure was cracking. I'm not familiar with the specifics of the removal process. That was handled by the contractors. James nodded, as though he had expected this answer. The contractors. The same ones who trespassed on Ms. Grayson's property multiple times, digging near the base of the tree and attempting to access a tunnel entrance beneath it. Would you like me to play the security footage for the court? Decker's attorney objected, but the judge overruled. James played the footage, showing the men prowling around Rebecca's yard late at night, their actions deliberate and coordinated. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the video ended. James turned back to Decker. What were they looking for, Mr. Decker? What's so important about the tunnels beneath Ms. Grayson's property that you were willing to violate her rights to get to them? Decker stammered, his confidence evaporating. I don't know what you're talking about. The HOA had no involvement in that. James didn't relent. Then why did the HOA approve the use of funds to hire those contractors? Why did emails between you and Terranova Development discuss leveraging Ms. Grayson's resistance to secure the land for future projects? He held up copies of the emails obtained through a subpoena. Decker's face turned pale as the judge allowed them to be admitted as evidence. The next witness was Rebecca herself. She testified with calm determination, detailing the harassment she had endured, the destruction of her home, and the calculated efforts to force her off her land. She presented the report from the structural engineer, which confirmed that the tree's fall was no accident, and she described the emotional toll of living under constant threat. I've lived in this home for years, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. It's more than just a house to me, it's my family's legacy. The HOA didn't just destroy my property, they tried to destroy my life. But I refused to let them take what's mine. The final blow came when James called a whistleblower to the stand, One of the HOA board members, a man named Andrew Hayes, had come forward with evidence of Decker's corruption. Hayes testified that Decker had manipulated the board into targeting Rebecca, using fabricated safety concerns as a pretext to force her out. He wanted the land, Hayes said plainly. The deal with Terra Nova was already in place. Rebecca's property was the last piece they needed. By the time the closing arguments were made, the evidence against the HOA was overwhelming. James delivered a powerful final statement, condemning their actions as a flagrant abuse of power driven by greed. The judge deliberated for less than an hour before delivering the verdict. The HOA was found guilty of property damage, trespassing, harassment, and conspiracy to defraud. They were ordered to pay Rebecca $500,000 in damages, including the cost of rebuilding her home and compensation for emotional distress. Luke Decker's smug demeanor was gone. As he left the courtroom, he avoided Rebecca's gaze, his shoulders slumped in defeat. It wasn't just a loss for him, it was the end of his reign of intimidation. Rebecca walked out of the courthouse with James at her side, feeling a sense of relief she hadn't known in months. The fight was over, and she had won. But more than that, she had exposed the corruption at the heart of the HOA, ensuring they could never victimize anyone else again. The cost had been high, but she had protected her home, her legacy, and her dignity, and that made every battle worth it. The air was crisp as Rebecca Grayson stood in her yard, looking out at the place where the great oak had once stood. The stump, now weathered and cracked, was a haunting reminder of everything she had endured over the past few months. But today, for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. The court's decision had not only vindicated her but had exposed the corruption that had festered in the neighborhood for years. Luke Decker's smug reign over the Homeowners Association was over, and the tangled web of Terra Nova Development's underhanded schemes had unraveled. The $500,000 judgment she had won was a significant victory, though Rebecca knew no amount of money could replace the history and meaning tied to the fallen oak. The funds would be used to rebuild her home, which had already begun to rise from the ashes of its former self, with a new, reinforced design that symbolized her resilience. Her land was hers once more, untouchable by any HOA decree or corporate greed. In the weeks following the trial, the neighborhood underwent a transformation. Decker had been removed from his position, and several board members had resigned in disgrace. A handful of residents, emboldened by Rebecca's fight, began to push for reforms within the HOA, demanding greater transparency and limits on its authority. What had once been a vehicle for control and intimidation was being reshaped into something fairer and less oppressive. Rebecca, however, had no desire to involve herself further. The neighbors who had turned a blind eye to her struggle were now eager to offer smiles and small talk as she passed by. She accepted their gestures with polite indifference, but remained distant. Her trust had been eroded, and she had no interest in rebuilding bridges that had been burned when she needed support the most. Instead, Rebecca focused on her property, reclaiming it piece by piece. The first thing she did was plant a new tree where the oak had stood. It wasn't the same nothing could be, but it was a start. She chose a sturdy sapling, another oak, and carefully planted it in the soil she had fought so hard to protect. As she packed the earth around its base, she felt a sense of closure, as though she were honoring her family's legacy while creating something new for the future. The tunnel entrance, once the center of so much turmoil, had been sealed. Rebecca had considered leaving it open as a reminder of the battle she had fought, but ultimately, she decided it was better to close that chapter of her life entirely. The concrete slab now bore a simple plaque, engraved with the words, "To those who stand their ground." It wasn't just a message for herself, it was a statement to anyone who tried to challenge her again. One quiet evening, as the sun set behind her newly rebuilt home, Rebecca sat on the porch with a glass of wine. The sounds of construction had faded, replaced by the hum of crickets and the rustle of leaves. The sapling swayed gently in the breeze, its young branches reaching skyward, full of promise. Rebecca thought of her great-grandfather and the vow he had made to never give up the land. She had kept that promise, and though the scars of the battle remained, she knew she had done the right thing. James Reeves stopped by later that evening, as he often did now that the chaos had subsided. They shared updates over drinks, reflecting on how far things had come. "You know," James said, swirling his glass, "you didn't just save your home. You changed the way this neighborhood operates. People are starting to stand up for themselves because of you." Rebecca smiled faintly. "I didn't set out to be anyone's inspiration," she replied. "I just wanted them to leave me alone." "Maybe," James said, "but you've set a precedent. Decker and Terranova won't be pulling this again anytime soon. You held the line when no one else would. That matters." Rebecca nodded, letting his words settle over her. She wasn't sure if she felt like a hero, but she knew she had earned her peace. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to relax. The fight was over, and the land was hers again, untouched, unyielding, and free. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Rebecca glanced toward the sapling and smiled. It wasn't just a tree, it was a promise that life would go on, stronger and steadier than before. The oak would grow, and so would she.